All right, so I will continue to monitor people trying to get into the call in the waiting room. But I want to get started in the interest of time because if any of you are anything like me, this is probably like your 5th or 6th call on the computer today, and you're probably ready for a break. I was joking to one of my colleagues the other day that I literally felt like my head was going to explode the other day after 7.5 hours on different calls. So thank you for coming and attending today and joining us for this discussion on how we can try to, keep school counseling positions in our school for next year. My name is Virginia DeLong, and I am a school counselor at Lebanon Middle School in Lebanon, Connecticut, which is in Eastern Connecticut. I am also the Government Relations and Advocacy Chair for the Connecticut School Counselor Association. And I thought it was important after talking to our lobbyists that we maybe do a call to kind of reach out to members and have a conversation about this, get some updates about what's happening at the state and the federal levels in terms of education and money and, all of that good stuff. And really just having a discussion about why it's important that each one of us takes time to advocate for keeping school counselors in our school. Really, in my opinion, it's not just about keeping school counselors in our schools that are currently there, but really there being a need for more support staff in general. And if you just heard me a few minutes ago, CSCA has been working really hard this year, not just to advocate for school counselors, but having school counselors, school psychologists, and social workers in all of our schools in the state. Our mental health needs of our students are certainly going to, if not actually already, increase as this pandemic continues on. And we know that we are going to be vitally needed come fall in our schools to be able to support the social and emotional health of our students. Really quickly, before I introduce my co-hosts for today and let them kind of share what they have for us, I attended a call yesterday, not a call, but I watched the webinar yesterday. It was a live call that the governor's reentry task force did, and it was with education, those that have been appointed on the education side of things. And the commissioner, obviously, he has several different points. I think he had about 5 different points that they're really focused on when talking about reentry in the fall. And one of those is the social and emotional health of our students. So I have reached out so far only through, you could submit questions to that task force. And I did reach out as the GRAC chair to just say, hey, not sure what your plans are for social and emotional health, but I think it's important that we make sure that those that are on the forefront of delivering those services are a part of those conversations. And the commissioner was very clear yesterday that they need to do a lot of listening to teachers, other staff, parents, any kind of stakeholder in this, to what people think needs to happen in the fall before they start making decisions. So I'm hoping that CSCA will have an opportunity to kind of have some seat at that table to provide feedback on what we think might be best for our students come fall. So with that being said, thank you for giving up your time today to join this call. I have 2 amazing co-hosts with me today. I have Amanda Fitzgerald, who is coming to us today from ASCA, and I also have Brian Sullivan, who is our one of our lobbyists for CSCA, who does amazing work for us. So I'm going to have Amanda go first. Brian and I talked, we thought we would like to hear kind of a federal level update, whatever you can share with us, Amanda, if you would be willing to do so.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Fitzgerald here from the American School Counselor Association. I work on the federal government relations for the association, and I've also been doing a call like this with our state chapters about 2 or 3 for a week. So everybody's in the same boat. States' budgets are going to be in very bad shape coming next year. So we have heard a lot of tough budgetary decisions that people are talking about. So I've been with the association for a number of years, and I was around in the 08 to 09 ARA talks during the last recession, the last stimulus bill. And I will say what's uplifting is that the conversations are very different this time. So when we knew a lot of this wraparound services and student supports were seen as extra, now they're talking much more about them being necessary. So you're hearing governors talk about school mental health or social emotional learning, or specifically about school counselors and school psychologists. So that is a very, very, very good sign. We lacked that completely a decade ago. So people, I think, and what I've heard from the school superintendents is that they had full understanding that we were in a mental health crisis before the pandemic. And we know that people have to talk about being in the right mindset and space to learn before we can talk about math and reading remediation. The other big thing about this situation is that it is happening globally. So the academic slide is going to be across the board for the whole country. So it's not necessarily like certain states are saying, oh no, we're losing our competitive edge. Everybody's losing the edge. Everybody's going to have to do some level of remediation. And that allows us to kind of talk about these other basic needs and mental health supports on a level playing field also. So we know that our kids can't learn if they don't feel safe and supported in school. So all that said, we have seen the federal government is going to step up in some way. They have already put forth some money. Just today, about a couple hours ago, the Democrats unveiled their latest COVID, I think they're calling it the HEROES Act. It's part 3 of the stimulus money. So in the ones that have been passed already, there's been $13 billion down to the states for education, but that also includes higher ed. So when we talk about higher ed or education funding, we're talking about the whole continuum. So I focus primarily on the K-12 stuff that's coming down. So of the last $13 billion that went out to states, there was specific language around $3 billion of it to talk about the continuity of learning and specifically addressing the social emotional needs of students. In the package that was just introduced today, and again, it's just a starting point because the Senate will counter this package. It has over $100 billion for the Department of Education, and specifically called out in it, and I'm just reading all of this again, just came out. There's 2 interesting: providing school-based supports for impacted students, family, and staff, including counseling, mental health services, family engagement efforts, and the coordination of physical health services. And then another good snippet about PD, professional development for school-based staff on trauma-informed care to restore the learning environment. So again, we'll see this all flushed out and what these numbers look like and what set-asides or call-outs we can get. ASCA, along with probably 50 other groups, sent a letter to all the governors already highlighting the SEL needs, and that dedicated funding and language should be prioritized in any state efforts. So we're working on it from that point, that perspective of like everything should be on par with the academic remediation. We have to talk about what this looks like for getting not only students but staff ready to get back into the building. So that's the law, that's the policy part. ASCA is also working on with about 20 to 30 other organizations. We hope it'll be ready mid-June. We're hoping for a June 15th release. Some very broad guidance on re-entry, the social emotional needs of re-entry, and we've got some of the SEL researchers working on that, as well as co-authors by the superintendents and principal organizations. It'll focus a lot on those tier 1 services. And that will be a tool that I think SCAs can use to push forward, saying, you know, this is going to be what the experts say needs to happen in order to get back into this reentry, or what reintegration looks like into these buildings. And that will be a 9 to 10 page document. We're also working simultaneously with our colleagues at the National Association School Psychologists to talk specifically about school level supports that school counselors and school psychologists can help during the reintegration process. That document we hope will also be out in June. And then later this summer, we have some proposals out to folks that have funding to do something like this. We're working on a state policy specific document that we could work with the chief state school officer, so your state superintendents of education and your state school boards. So hopefully that document will be before technically the first day of school, hopefully late summer. And that's still in the proposal phase. We don't actually have a green light to produce that document yet, but I'm hopeful that will work. I did watch that. I saw the webinars about the MTSS series about returning to school that the MTSS for school counselors are doing. They're excellent. I really appreciate all of the work and the that's gone into those. So those I highly recommend, and I'm looking forward to the last one about trauma-informed practices to come out too. So that's in the chat box. And I'll leave it there and let everyone else go, and then I can answer any questions I might have the answers to or not, or find out more information for you as we go along.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. That's all very helpful information. Brian, who is one of our lobbyists, Brian and Ken represent us very well and keep us informed of what's going on at the state capitol. So I'm going to allow Brian to talk and give us some updates about what he knows is going on at the state level.
Hi, everybody. Fortunately, Connecticut probably started in one of the better places in terms of budgets compared to a lot of other states. So over the last probably 3 to 4 years, Connecticut up a rainy day fund about $2.5 billion. So that's a huge number, but yet they're already looking at that number and projecting that that number is going to go down this year. And then come next year, by July next year, that 2.5 billion could be completely wiped out. And most of it is related to lost revenues. Obviously the sales tax, income tax, all down. Almost every revenue stream is down to some extent, not to mention the fact that our special transportation fund with the gas tax is in real trouble. So they'll need to come up with some kind of financial solution for that. Governor Lamont had Secretary McCaw with him at a press conference a couple of weeks ago. I think I sent kind of an update about the budget and the numbers that they're looking at. I think at the current fiscal year, it was like $500 million in losses just from the last 2 months. So that tells you how bad things got and how quickly it happened. And most of it was not related to COVID costs. I think they spent about $400 million in COVID expenses, but most of the expenses or most of the losses were just based on the revenue losses. So Governor Lamont, like other governors, Governor Cuomo, especially in some of the states in the Northeast that have been hit harder, have been pushing Congress and the administration to pass a package that has funding for states. If you open up the front page of the New York Times or any other paper, there's that conversation that's going on in DC where there's a disagreement between the House and the Senate, which I think Amanda mentioned and talked about. So Connecticut is really going to be beholden to the federal government and what they're able to step in and provide. And in the absence of providing any kind of relief for those lost revenues, it's likely that there's going to be extensive cuts that will have to come into place. Now, Governor Lamont was asked specifically, what would you tell mayors and school boards and finance boards in terms of coming up with your budgets? Because they're looking at their budgets right now for July 1st and trying to develop a budget under completely unknown circumstances and times. They have no idea what resources they'll get from the state. Our General Assembly has not been back into session for a real session this year since March, early March. And it's likely they'll come in at the end of June if they can figure out the way to practice good social distancing and other practices, masks and whatnot, and separation. So it's, right now it's very unclear, but Governor Lamont said that he would like to hold states or municipalities flat funded. So that is what he's going to try to do. He's going to try not to make cuts, but as we know, even if you flat fund, that can often lead to cuts on the local level. And, when I talked with Eileen and Virginia, and the concern is that the first people often on the chopping block are school counselors, other support staff, and never has it been more needed probably than come September when these students return from this long layoff. I would expect there's going to be more needs, especially in those schools that we know have less counselors, in some of our urban settings or even our rural settings here in Connecticut. So with that in mind, I wanted to kind of trigger the conversation and start talking about strategies to deal on a local level, but also coming back up to the state, because we've put in a lot of work over the last few years with a lot of the key state stakeholders, whether they're the education chairs or the education commissioner himself, or it's other groups that are involved with education. And I think we need to come up with a policy for CSCA, the organization as a whole, but also to give direction locally to how school counselors can advocate for them and their students' needs to local boards of education, especially in the time of COVID, when it's really hard to advocate with anybody when you're doing it all online. So I'm happy to answer and field any questions about the budget, about school policy. As we know, school was completely canceled. That was announced last week. I think they're going to try to do summer school, and guidance should be coming out about summer school after July, but that's going to be much more limited than obviously a major opening of school, which is going to be targeted, I think, for September. But again, guidance is still yet to come. So I'm happy to answer any questions and talk further about that, but I want to hear everybody's thoughts today and as we move forward.
So I'm going to ask that if you have any questions or any thoughts, if you could put them in the chat box, and we'll try to read your questions and get them answered as we go along. And while I wait for some of you to do that, or if you'd like to speak and say something, if you could just put that in the chat box, and so then I can specifically address you, so we're not all talking over each other. That would be good too. So yesterday when I was watching that call with the commissioner, Marco Jakian, who is the president of the community colleges and university system, as well as Fran Rabinowitz, who represents the superintendents, Bob Radar, who represents the Connecticut administrators, or the boards of ed, excuse me, and then the guy whose name I always forget because he's new, that represents the Connecticut Administrators Association, was also there, as well as some other commissioners that work for the Department of Education, like Beth Bai, who does early childhood education. So they had a number of people. It was more informational than it was. I thought it was going to be more them answering questions that people had asked, but it really was more scripted. And I will be honest, when it got to the higher ed piece, because I had to be on another call at that time, I didn't stay on for that piece of it. So I only listened to the K-12. But there seemed to be across the board support from all the associations in terms of social emotional, learning, and how we were going to address the social emotional needs of students come fall. There wasn't a lot of solution giving on this call. It was just more talking about what they saw as the needs and what needed to be addressed. But I did feel that it was positive that each of the organizations were kind of, focused on that. However, as those of us who have been involved, and there are several on this call, have been involved in the advocacy efforts for CSCA in the last couple of years, and working with Brian, know that it's a continuous and constant almost in some ways nagging at some of these groups to say, hey, hi, here we are, you know, like, don't forget about us, and, you know, and sharing our ideas and support. So while they say that it's important, I really think it's going to take a lot of us to really push for a seat at the table in these conversations, and how this is going to work, and how, you know, we can support, you know, them saying that SEL is important, but actually showing that it's important by making sure that we're keeping our student support staff in our schools. So I see there's some questions that people had, and I'm going to try to go back. So it looks like, Amanda, first question is, do you have a sense as to when Connecticut would see the money related to the HEROES Act? As Brian said, our boards of ed are trying to pass budgets now.
So I will say, when the CARES package went down, the money came actually after it was actually passed. It came to states rather quickly, way faster than what we've seen in the past. So the problem is like, we're in the game of politics. So the Senate Republicans are going to come back, and you've heard, I think Brian alluded to, Leader McConnell has said, we're going to let the blue, I mean, he specifically called out the Northeast, we're going to let those blue states go bankrupt, which he won't do. I'm sure it's like, I don't think they can do. I know 49 states have to end with a balanced budget. And while Connecticut sounds like they're in much better shape compared to the rest of the country, there are many states in the red right now. So what they have to do is negotiate back and forth, and the numbers that the Democrats put out, I'm sure, are much higher than what will actually get passed down. But I don't think that this is the end of the packages. So this package will come down, and then there'll be more that, especially when you look at state budgets, generally speaking, education, K-12 and higher ed, make up about 40% of a state budget. And because of the revenue shortfalls everywhere, property tax, and not just that nobody's shopping right now, but many states delayed the deadline for you to file and pay your taxes, which just that delay has created an enormous shortfall in money that they would typically have had in their pockets now. So all of those things considered, is now the Hill has to battle this out, and they're going to go back and forth for I don't know, 10 days, 2 weeks. And then hopefully within 3 weeks of that, they would see some money. So the money that's coming down now is really to beef up what they're still trying to do, and probably summer school. And I think there'll be a larger state fiscal stabilization fund that will pass later on down the road that tries to level them off where they are. So no good answer to that. We're at the very beginning stages of this next package.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So even when they do receive the money, do you know how, like, what, and maybe Brian, you would know the answer to this, I'm not sure, like how that money would then be delineated across the state? Like, is it certain areas that are going to get priority of the money, or it will be kind of even?
So in my experience, it goes to the state education agency, and then they distribute usually on a formula. So like, think about how your states get Title I dollars. So that's by and large what happens, but maybe Brian knows more specifically how it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be multiple factors. It will depend on the language of the bill. So if they have certain pockets of money for a certain task, like they want to put money into social emotional learning or something like that, they could have different pots of money. But as a whole, if it was just a bucket of cash, they would probably divide it up the same way that they divide up other education funds. Although I would expect that certain districts, especially the alliance districts, the urban districts that we have in Connecticut, would be asking maybe for more money. And they're going to probably see more of a need when you have, a higher percentage of students maybe that haven't even accessed the online learning. So, I think it's too early to fully tell until Congress passes something what the state will do. The state would probably respond the same way. Well, we don't know until we see the money. But that is unfortunately what the state is waiting on, because without getting those dollars, they just have to make bad decisions, a series of them. And then I saw a couple of questions about the recover, the reopen CT group. That is my understanding of Reopen CT, and there's been criticism about the lack of transparency of the group, but that's focused about coming up with standards for reopening. I'm not sure they're going to get into the types of things where it's going to be addressing long-term problems that are going to come after COVID. So I think the governor responded to a question yesterday saying that he thinks it's wrapping up soon. So I would, I'm not really too focused on Recover CT. I would be more focused on your local level at this point, and then as an association, having an established position about, maybe it's a letter that goes out to all superintendents, but, really, there needs to be a bottom up, top down kind of response at the local level, but also us at the state level when we're responding to folks. And it's going to take very creative solutions. And I don't think anybody has them at this point. So if people do have ideas and strategies, and a lot of that is going to come down to the money again, then absolutely, as CSCA, we should put those on the table, because I expect that people will listen. My initial concern before we even get to that point is, again, these local budgets that get made, and will we start seeing counselors, getting furloughed? I think Peg has a question about the furloughing. I haven't heard that yet, and I think the governor was trying to avoid it through some of his executive orders. I haven't heard that, but I would not be surprised, because local governments still control their budgets. And so the really, fiscally more conservative districts might say, well, we don't want to take a risk and wait on the federal government or the state. We need to make the cuts now. And that's what my biggest concern is over the next 2 months.
So I just have a few notes here. Creating an established position from CSCA on this that could be sent out to superintendents. Would you also recommend that we send something out to the governor and the commissioner of education, or?
Probably. I mean, but it depends on what as CSCA wants to do. I mean, if you have something to offer, if it's more of just we want to start a conversation, we would urge you to, the commissioner to set up a task force to study student mental health. I mean, you can be creative. I'm not going, I don't know what other states are doing. Maybe Amanda can talk about what some other states are doing, or keep you updated going forward, because this is very early on in terms of that conversation.
It is. I think a lot of people are reaching out to like local school boards or superintendents or whoever has that local decision making in terms of money. One thing I recommend, like, instead of preserve school counselor jobs, is really focus in on the services school counselors provide. So why that's going to be so important for students going forward, and if they're going to lack any services, we can't neglect their well-being. And then I can't remember what else I was going to say. So I think you can start doing like a local push of something if you, again, can highlight the needs. Once we have some of those tools for you too, we'll push them out to you. So you could, these are the guidelines. Oh, another thing to keep in mind is, so we are watching a lot of like rural versus urban versus suburban to see what their reentry plans look like. And so even if schools open, there probably will be caveats if there's no vaccine or treatment for some sort of optional virtual education, because they're not going to force kids with medically fragile family members into school buildings. So that's another thing to think about how, as an association, you can provide these. The thing we're concerned about is, when we do go back, if we have to flip-flop between this virtual and in-person work, or if it's a hybrid, or if it's optional, is those social emotional supports getting out during the virtual time, so we don't have this backslide of social preparedness for these students that have been in isolation for all this time. So that's another kind of hook. A lot of people see the really dramatic trauma that people are seeing, like obviously death from COVID and homelessness and unemployment, but just explaining to these folks what your role is in working with students that have been isolated for months. We're going to put kids back into a cafeteria or a classroom or a recess that have virtually had no socialization. So all of those things that, you know, you all work on every single day with students will be so vitally important, and supporting those classroom teachers in having everyone kind of get back to work. So some of those not so obvious things school counselors do, as opposed to like the really mental health, working with the kids that will need those tier 2 and tier 3 services, really honing in on what those tier 1 services are going to look like for every kid.
And I want to, you know, if there's no further follow-up on that, I want to respond to Peg's question about keeping track of what you're responding to, because I do think that's a good idea. I think CSCA should be trying to track the experiences that you're having with students, trying to track, and I'm not sure how much of this is possible, but even if it's anecdotal, at the end of this, or maybe over the summer, you can put out a report or something, but tracking the differences in services being offered in certain types of districts, which we just talked about. And you can point out, you know, we didn't have there was no school counselors helping kids in these districts, and we're now seeing this. And, you know, I think a lot of that data will come long term, but we can at least report on what we're hearing, what we're seeing. And then as we get into these local budgets, I would want to really track if we're seeing school support services decreasing. And then that's the real push that we need to make on the state level, is this is not a time to cut school support services. What kind of state policy are you going to come up with? Is there going to be a pot of money for the less fortunate districts to meet these needs? But anything creative that we can come up with, and we had already started down this path, so I think it's a natural extension. But there's a lot of you know, data and information that I think would be useful to collect and maybe report on, because, you know, I think the news media would be willing to listen to what school counselors had to say. Like, we just tracked 3 months of something that had never been done before, with schools, and the lack of the physicality and the socialization, and what was that like? What was that experience like? And what can we do better in the future, and what policies would we recommend to the state?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I know that in our district, everybody's required to be tracking what you're doing. I know that may not be the case in every district, but honestly, it's probably more of a big brother thing, so that superintendents can be sure to report out to boards of ed that our staff are actually doing their job. But I think I saw Peg's comment about, getting out some type of template, or at least letting our members know that if you haven't been tracking, you might want to backtrack for the last 8 weeks, which I know can be a daunting task, but going through your emails, going through your calendar, going through whatever to kind of be tracking what you've been doing, how many students you've been meeting with. I know personally I've been meeting with more students that I don't see on a normal basis at school, more so now, because they just need that support. And it's actually been harder to kind of get in touch with some of my regulars than it is the new kids. So I think that's something I wrote down that I think is also a good idea for us to get out to members. I had thought about doing a template kind of letter to a board of education, but as I was writing, I was finding it was really hard because we have very different districts in Connecticut. You definitely have your urban, your rural, your suburban, but how our districts are run are also very different throughout the state. And so it's not that I can't do that. I think I just have to put some more thought into it because I was feeling kind of stuck. And I was like, well, you might write this, or you might write that, or you might write this. So I had a lot of unknowns that made it hard to make a template for that. But I do think that it's important that if you, in particular right now, because we already have some districts that are already putting on the chopping block career counselors and school counselors and social workers and school psychologists, if you know that you're already in a district that's considering that, is to start working on crafting a letter to your board of education and your superintendent who are having to make those decisions and talk about those cuts. But another thing that CSCA does provide, or I guess more a service that I provide as the GRAC chair, is I am willing to write letters to from CSCA to your boards of education if you have positions that are looking to be cut. I've already written a few already in the last couple of weeks. All you have to do is send me an email. Again, the data is really great. So the people who've asked for these letters have provided me with some pretty great data to help me in support of writing my letter. So I can, cite some of that data within the letter I'm writing to your boards of education. I think it's important for us to do that as an association because it shows people that school counselors are out there and we are looking out for our members and we are paying attention. So I am happy to do that if you reach out to me. But I also think letters need to come from individual school counselors. One thing I've learned over the years is school counselors are the worst at advocating for themselves. Everybody else, we advocate for everybody else all day long, but when it comes to advocating for ourselves, we always put ourselves on the back burner. And I do understand that right now we are all exhausted from this distance learning and the thought of having to put together a letter, but it's all about our kids at the end of the day. And we need these positions in our school to help support our kids at school. So I think it's, something that everyone should be considering, even if you don't think that your position may be cut, really thinking about how can you craft a letter instead about being a part of reentry conversations. I saw Lisa as a part of her district's reentry task force, which is great. But I think we need to also be thinking in the sense of how do we show the importance of what we do as school counselors as we move forward? Because I think if they're also seeing that, if it does happen to come up about cutting school counselors, they might think twice about it. If you've already had those conversations about what you can do as a school counselor to help our students come.
And Virginia, just to add on to that, it's not just your superintendents either. It's a lot of times it's your local boards of education who are making the budget decisions, but they're kind of once removed. So they don't know necessarily what's going on the ground. So that's why it becomes that much more critical for us to document information and data, document the needs of what you're seeing your students are going through, the differences. And then long term, I mean, we're talking about a second wave, which is scary to think about. But I think over the summer, CSCA has to start thinking too about, okay, if this comes up again, what can we do better? What kind of best practices can we put out there to the state and to other education stakeholders to make sure that students throughout the state get better access to whether it's school counselors or other mental health services? Absolutely.
I see there's some questions. Anything new? Okay. So, and in line with that too, I'm always happy to look at letters. I know sometimes writing letters to these types of people can be a little nerve-wracking. So I'm always happy to proofread letters as well if you're looking for some feedback before submitting.
And if you see, and I would say if you see news of different towns or if it's your district that you're hearing things about, I would say bring it to the attention of CSCA. Whether CSCA can do something about it, not necessarily. I mean, these local governments are going to have to make really challenging decisions, but at the very least, CSCA can, and Virginia's done this time and time again, can come up with a letter that can be utilized to go out to that school and at least put a little bit of pressure on them that's not the easy cut. That's the bad, poor cut in this situation, and that's the case you have to make. And then long term, the case has to be made for more school counselors in more places. So I'm looking at people like Jennifer who can maybe dig into the data in the future and say, look at the outcomes that we saw from that learning. But that's off in the distance a bit.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments that people want to make?
Or even suggestions.
Yeah, or suggestions. Oh, you're welcome, Peg. I enjoy this. I don't know. I never thought I would enjoy the advocating piece because it's a lot of work, but
you had your best testimony right before we wrapped it all up.
No, and there, COVID flew it out the window. I swear, it was like literally the week before, right? my emotional testimony.
I will just add on a legislative front, this session, they passed one bill. So last Wednesday would have been the last day of session. So there was no education policy. There was no, a lot of bills got left on the chopping block because of the way the session ended. And so we're expecting a special session probably at the end of June before the July 1st, fiscal year changes over. They might try to do some other stuff beyond the budget, but it's really going to be limited. So it's really setting up kind of a backlog of legislation and bills going into this election. And then whoever comes out of this election come 2021, there is going to be a ton of issues, not just responding to COVID, but responding to all types of other issues that just did not get addressed this year. So with that comes opportunity. And so it is an opportunity for CSCA to continue to make our voices heard.
And the session next year is a long session, correct? Yeah. Okay.
That's another thing is that all these legislators, they won't be on the campaign trail necessarily, but they'll be out there. They'll be out there running for office, and a lot of them will have to find new and creative ways to do it. So again, and maybe I'll talk to Virginia about doing a session in June or something where we can talk to you about reaching out to candidates on how to get this front and center on their radar. It's one of the best times to interface with candidates is when they're on the campaign trail, they're more responsive, they're willing to listen to the problems, and then they might commit to you. Oh, I will fight for this. So we need as many advocates like that as possible. I think we've developed a couple that are interested, but you need more and more as we go forward. So that's just something else to keep in mind.
And I can tell you, we seriously started this advocacy work about 3 years ago. It doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it has been about 3 years. And our very first meeting with anyone really significant was with the education committee. And it was a very tiny room, and there were probably about 30 people crammed in there. And my heart was racing, and I thought, I can't talk to these people. Oh my God, like, what are we going to do? And really, it was the best experience to start that way because it wasn't that scary and it wasn't that bad. And I think that a lot of people get nervous to talk to their legislators, but really, they are people just like you. Like, some of them were teachers before, or, electricians, or, certain businessmen, but they're not that bad to talk to. And I know that there seems to be a hesitation with our membership in wanting to reach out to legislators. Any of us are happy to talk you through that. If you do have an opportunity to, speak to them and you want some support, please always reach out to us at CSCA, and we're happy to do what we can to support you.
I want to underscore that point that you just made, because Connecticut's legislature is a part-time legislature. Mm-hmm. So unlike a lot of states, if you look to the South, you look to the North, Massachusetts, New York, they have full-time legislatures dealing with problems. We don't. We have people, like Virginia said, that are former teachers. We have people that are the chief of staff to the Trinity president. We have somebody that's an undertaker. So you can't get the full, types of legislators. They don't know everything about these topics. So they need to hear from people like you in their district. And the more local it can be, the better it always is. Hearing from CSCA is one thing, but hearing from a constituent or a resident or a teacher or a counselor in their district is even more important.
Yeah. And a lot of our private conversations that we've had, not, whole committees, but we've had a lot of one-on-one meetings with people, have been really positive, and they want to understand. They want to know what we do as school counselors. We give them throw a lot of information at them. I tend to be a rapid talker when I get in there because they only give you like 15 minutes. So I've gotten good at the speed talking. But I think they're eager for the information when we are present with them. And it's not, I feel like the intimidation just kind of, you're like, once you get in there, you're like, oh, this isn't bad at all.
I'll add, the commissioner has, I think unlike the last commissioner, I think this commissioner has shown an inclination to want to support school counselors.
Yes.
More more so than past commissioners. So that might hopefully be another opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. So just some of the notes that I took, you know, I'm going to reach out to our Government Relations Committee for those of you who are on this call that are on that. So be on the lookout for an email. If there's anyone on here, this call, who's interested in joining our Government Relations Committee, please reach out to me. Michelle, would you mind typing my email address in the chat for me? Thank you. Please reach out, because I'm always happy to take on new committee members. But I think we're going to meet and kind of talk about what position we want to take so we can start working on some of these letters out to superintendents and some of these other groups to help our members out, and some ideas of getting things, you know, tools out to members in terms of tracking data and whatnot. So that'll be coming soon. Again, I still offer the service if you'd like CSCA to write a letter because of a position you know that's being cut. Please, by all means, reach out, and we'll make that happen. Or if you just want us to, you know, look at, you know, an email or a letter that you're writing to your Board of Education, your superintendent, or even maybe when you get to that point, some of your legislators. We're always happy to assist in any way that we can in that department, because we're all about advocating and, you know, keeping our school counselor positions in our schools, but also our ultimate goal is to increase the number of school counselors in school with reasonable ratios for our school counselors, including elementary school counselors. So that's what we were really pushing for this year. And, you know, we were kind of working hard on some of that and, you know, adding some things into the language that didn't necessarily cost money, but still trying to push for the reasonable ratios in school counselors in all of our schools at the same time. So are there any other questions or comments? My email is in the chat. Michelle typed it out. It is CSCAadvocacy @gmail.com. I check my email every day. So I will be happy to get back to you if you need to reach out. Or if you're interested in joining the committee, reach out as well.
And please do let Virginia know if you hear or see, you know, a lot of these stories don't make the news, so we don't always know that so position is on the chopping block. So if you hear those types of things, bring it to our attention. Maybe there's a legislator, maybe there's somebody we can reach out to, maybe there's not, but we just need to know what's happening on the ground.
And we will try to keep you posted if we get more information. I tend to like to give out information. We do it through e-blast through our members, but we know you're inundated with email. If you're not you do not like CSCA on Facebook, I highly, strongly recommend that you like CSCA on Facebook. I do go on there and try to give government relations updates now and then. I haven't done one in a while, but I probably will go on soon to do that. With some of this information, and try to keep everybody apprised of what's happening as we go along. So if there are no other questions, thank you so much for joining today. Thank you, Amanda, for giving up your time today to join us, and Brian as well. It was very helpful, I think, and informative to get some of this information about what's going on and how we can take some steps forward to hopefully secure school counseling positions in Connecticut for next year and going forward. All right, everybody.